In 1976, Eldritch Wizardry introduced radical new concepts to Dungeons and Dragons, forever changing the face of the game by introducing concepts like druids, psionics, demons, and artifacts. Join me as I delve into the secrets of this supplement today on Daddy Roll the One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. Today, we're going to be looking at the 1976 publication of Supplement 3, Eldritch Wizardry, for original Dungeons and Dragons. Now, of course, back then, they wouldn't have called it original Dungeons and Dragons because there was only one version of the game in 1976, which was just Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this book, like the two supplements that came before it, Greyhawk and Blackmore, introduces a lot of new optional content for the game that's going to actually end up becoming core parts of the game for the decades that follow, all the way up until the 2024 release of D&D that was released just beginning at the end of last year. So today is Monday, February 3rd of 2025, and the 2024 edition's been out for a few months now. But this book, this supplement, is going to introduce things like the Druid class for player characters. Now, I know there's somebody out there right now that's probably saying Druids were actually introduced in Greyhawk. Yes, they were, as monsters. This supplement introduces them as an option for a player character. It's also going to introduce the concept of psionics, mind powers, and iconic monsters like demons, Orcus, Demogorgon, iconic treasures and artifacts like the Axe of the Dwarvish Lords. All of that comes from this book, and it's also going to include yet another sort of alternative combat system. It's really more of an expansion or a revision to the alternative combat system. It's going to add granularity to the combat round, and that's going to presage some of the changes that are going to happen in advanced Dungeons & Dragons combat system that's going to debut really over the next 3 years. That system debuts 1977, 78, and 79. And so all of that starts with this particular book here. And so we are going to look at this and talk about the first time that these concepts are published in the game and then how they change over time. Now, one of the things that I need to make sure people kind of understand is when I use the word publish. So it has kind of some different meanings, or it's a fluidity of meanings of what this term means. When I use the word publish, I'm meaning that it is in an official publication, usually by TSR. It could be a third-party publisher, but that it is commercially available. That means that they have distribution where it's either nationwide or could even be worldwide, where you could walk into a store and buy it. So some of these concepts were originally published in other formats, okay? And it's because at the dawn of the hobby, especially in the first few years, there was just so much content coming out, a lot of it created by fans. People were creating content. They were excited about this game, and they were excited about the possibilities of being able to design elements for this game. And so you have things like fanzines, you have alarms and excursions, you have things like Len Lekofka's Les Anges Dangereux, which was originally a diplomacy zine, but it starts to incorporate more and more Dungeons and Dragons content over time. And then you have, things like Europa. You have things like newsletters, such as the Great Plains Games Players newsletter. And a lot of times content is originally being published in some of those formats, and it's not limited to those, before it reaches its final form. However, while those are published, okay, they're not commercially available. The Great Plains Games Players newsletter, just the name itself, Great Plains, it's indicating there's an implication that it is limited in geography, and you had to be aware that organization existed and then sign up, join the organization and then get that newsletter. Okay, so while it's out there, you're talking about like a few hundred copies at most. Okay. Another way things got distributed would be at conventions. TSR's running adventures, and a lot of times you could purchase copies of that adventure at the convention if they had them available for sale. But again, that's limited in geography to the people who were at that convention, and it's just a few dozens of copies, right? So it's not mass distribution. So while all of those things are important, and I don't mean to say that publishing in that format is any less viable or any less important, because of the lack of record keeping, and also, again, looking at the lack of mass distribution. I tend to use the word publish when I'm talking about something like this that was like available. You could walk into a store and buy it. Okay, so that's what I mean when I have the history and the knowledge, knowing that something that was published in one of these official books originally appeared in a different format somewhere else. I will definitely talk about that. So when I talked about the Thief class as an example that was published in Greyhawk, that Thief did originally appear in the Great Plains Games Players newsletter in sort of a beta format written by Gary Gygax. And, we talked about how he got that idea from a phone call that he received from Gary Switzer from Santa Monica, California. His game group at the Aero Hobbies game store in Santa Monica at the time had kind of developed that class, mechanically developed that class. Of course, we know that Thieves as a concept or as a role also existed in Blackmore. But, not like the mechanics weren't really necessarily there because that format of game was slightly different than what we see in the published version of Dungeons and Dragons. But in any event, when I have that information available, I will share it. Okay, so that is a good time, however, for me to mention that if you really enjoy these kinds of deep dives into the history of Dungeons and Dragons and some of these early products, and really the core concepts, where they came from, how they have changed and developed over time to impact the way that people play the game today, if you're playing the new edition, then please remember that if you're enjoying that, please like this video. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and then hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new videos just like this one. So again, really kind of important on that subscription thing. It just last video from last week. When I mentioned this, a couple people jumped in the comments and said, "Hey, I'm one of those people that thought I was subscribed to your channel because I keep getting your videos served to me by the algorithm," which is great that they're getting them, but they didn't realize that they'd been watching all this time and weren't subscribers. So if that sounds like you, please double check that, because, subscriptions really help channels like mine. Okay, now with that said, let's go ahead and look at this supplement, and I'm just going to start with the cover. So this is going to be the first supplement that is published by TSR for Dungeons and Dragons that's going to feature a full color cover here. Okay, so, and you see it's very different from the two supplements that came before, which is going to be Greyhawk and Blackmore. For those of you who are listening and not watching, the Greyhawk and Blackmore supplements are tan. They have black ink drawings that are very just kind of like your standard, there's not a lot of shading. There's not a lot of, even perspective or anything like that. They're pretty flat kind of drawings, and they're very much consistent with the artwork that you saw on the original Three Little Brown Books from the original box set of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, they look very consistent with that, even like the layout and the material, like this brown kind of, it looks like faux leather almost kind of covers. Okay, but then Eldritch Wizardry is going to completely change that. So you see that this, again, it's full color. It doesn't follow the same format. You have this like box that goes all the way across that has the illustration in here, done with pastel, full color. And this is TSR starting to experiment. This is 1976. So in 1975, when these two supplements are published, Greyhawk and Blackmore, you also have the publication of Boot Hill, the first edition of Boot Hill, which is done in this same format of this kind of tan cover book, digest size. So they're sticking with digest for now. But the Boot Hill book, the game, looks very consistent with these. So this is a big change for them. Now, you also in 1975, of course, had the release of Empire of the Petal Throne as a box set, which is a role-playing game, although they weren't using that term at the time. And it is full color, and it is a, I don't want to say normal size, but it's, it's bigger than digest size. It's like a standard kind of, 8.5 by 11-ish size, rule book with the box set. So, but this, as far as like the digest books, is kind of like your first change in this look and feel of these other ones. Okay. So if you saw this on a shelf, with the exception of the title Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, I guess, you've got your little wizard guy down here as your logo, because this is a later printing. Originally, it would have been closer to this, the lizard. But it looks different. It looks very different. Now, the font, of course, is the same. That's the big key here. So this is a font called Quentin. And you can actually buy this font online, I think, still, and use it for, if you want to like try to publish something that has a look and feel that's very similar to this. All right, but we see it's additional rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures, just like these books say. Supplement 3, Eldritch Wizardry. Okay, so this painting, or this illustration here, is done by a female artist named Deborah Larson. And as far as I can tell, so she was based in Minneapolis, from what I understand, and I think this is the only piece of artwork that she did for TSR. So I did some research, and I found a lot of other people asking the same question I did, which is, I'm asking, which is, what else did she do? And like sort of give us some history of this person. And I can't find anything. I found a blog that was started by an artist named Deborah Larson back in like 2019, where she this person, Deborah, looked like was going to start a blog talking about her history of artwork, but only posted one picture, which wasn't this. And there's no other content on that blog other than another D&D person who is a guy, his name's DJ. And I met him at DaveCon last year in April, and he is on the blog, like asking questions of the creator of that blog, like, are you the Deborah Larson that created this painting? And she never answers. And that is about the extent of what I can find out from her. So people are trying to figure this out, and it's unfortunate that we don't know a lot. Now, what we see on this cover, and again, this is for people who are listening and not watching, is an unclothed female figure lying on her back on what looks like it. It's probably a stone altar, some kind of, let's call it an altar. Okay, and then there's like it looks like a brazier kind of behind her with flames coming out of it, and her hair is cascading down over the edge of the altar. And that's it. There are no other figures in this painting. This is probably going to be, I'd say it's safe to say this is going to be the most, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but most lurid cover for a Dungeons and Dragons product officially published by TSR. Given the unclothed nature of this figure here. And, but it's really interesting because, I think it's obviously speaking to who they thought the audience was. It's also speaking to the pulp sword and sorcery inspirations of the game. But they're not going to use this and go in this direction as far as the artwork down the line, which is really interesting. So you do have some nudity in this book as far as some of the demons that are going to be in here. And you do have that in the Monster Manual, 1977, the line drawings inside. And I think also in Deities and Demigods, 1980, there's a few deities in there who are at least, bare-chested women. And but that's really going to be about it. So this, like, while this cover, it was pretty controversial at the time. I've read stories online of stores that like wrapped it in brown paper or would refuse to sell it to kids. Definitely this was going to be something that was going to be used by opponents of Dungeons and Dragons later on during the Satanic Panic. I have a whole video about that Satanic Panic, but this definitely doesn't help their case at all with this type of illustration. Now, most people think that this painting was inspired by the cover of a story by A. Merritt back in 1932 called Dwellers of the Mirage. And you can see that cover here. And so obviously it's reversed, the image is flipped, but you can see probably the inspiration for that from this. However, the idea of the female sacrifice, and let's, assume that she's going through some kind of ritual, and given the name of the book is Eldritch Wizardry, we can assume that it is a nefarious type of ritual and that she's probably in a little bit of danger here. And so that trope of like the sacrificial, female victim on the altar is rife throughout sword and sorcery fiction. So whether you see depictions of it or not from an illustrative standpoint, you will read about them a lot of times in stories. So she could have been, she meaning Deborah Larson, could have been inspired by any other sources. But it's just, the actual illustration looks very, very close to that one from the cover of the A. Merritt story. And that was also common for TSR artists back in the day. They tended to copy things that they had seen a lot of times from comic books. And that's a whole thing. It's very well known that a lot of the illustrations, especially in the original books like Men in Magic and Monsters and Treasure and Underworld and Wilderness Adventures from the original box set, a lot of those drawings were copies of like poses and stuff from comics, a lot of like Nick Fury stuff, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., a lot of Doctor Strange comics. And then they would just change like, the weapons or the armor and the clothing, but like the actual poses are pretty much identical. So that was a well-known thing. But this is, again, it's an interesting painting because it is sort of just out of place in the entire rest of the history of Dungeons and Dragons, either before or after this. As far as the subject of the painting. All right, now it says it's by Gygax and Bloom, which is really interesting. And we'll talk about that later. So this is a copy I acquired later on. I didn't have this back in the day. Okay, now here's interesting. It says on the inside front cover, we're going to continue on with this. It says that it is ancient and powerful magic. Okay, so that's Eldritch Wizardry. Now, the term Eldritch, most people say this is a nod to H.P. Lovecraft. He loved to use this term Eldritch when he was describing things like this, kind of like ancient and dark magics. And so this is probably, again, a nod to that. And when you realize, of course, that H.P. Lovecraft is listed in the Appendix N of the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide as far as inspirational fiction, that makes sense. Okay, and then it says, with special thanks to Elder Steve Marsh, Dennis Sester, the great Druid, Jim Ward, and Tim Kask for suggestions and contributions. And apologies if I mispronounced Dennis Sester's last name. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce that. And then it says illustrations by Dave Sutherland, Tracy Lech, and Gary Quapiche, I think. Cover by Deborah Larson. We talked about that. So we've talked many, many, many times about Dave Sutherland. Tracy Lech and Gary are only going to do, each of them are only going to do one illustration here, and we'll get to that. But the rest of the interiors are going to be by Dave Sutherland. Okay, so I have a much later copy. So I have a 9th printing from November of 1979. It was originally printed in 1976, as you see here. And this 9th printing thing, I'm going to bring that up later when we get to something. But it's interesting as far as this book coming together and who's responsible for the content in here. So right out the gate, most people don't really know what it is that Brian Bloom contributed to this particular book. So a lot of people think that his name is on the cover here because he was one of the co-founders of Dungeons and Dragons, or of TSR, put money in to help found the company. Originally helped put money in to found Tactical Studies Rules, and then later on, again, was a co-founder of TSR Inc. And so his name's on the cover because of his role in the company rather than his contributions. Whereas we know in here, well, this is credited to Dave Arneson, Blackmore Supplement. And it says, with special thanks to Gary Gygax, Tim Kask, Rob Kuntz, and Steve Marsh, which is interesting because most people believe that the monk class that debuts in Blackmore was created by Brian Bloom. So anyway, that's a story there. Now we're going to get into these other creators, Steve Marsh, Dennis Sester, and Jim Ward and Tim Kask as we go through this. Now, this would be edited by Tim Kask, originally hired as an editor at TSR, and their first employee. And he has his own YouTube channel. He's still around. He's still with us, and he makes videos. And a lot of his videos are are interesting because a lot of them are like questions. People just write in and ask him questions about working at TSR back in the day, and then he makes videos where he goes through and answers those questions. And he's actually answered some of mine before that I've talked about here on the channel. So in 1974, I think it was, in the summer of 74, Gary Gygax was already talking about the idea of wanting to have like a third supplement. So at that point, these haven't even come out. Greyhawk and Blackmore haven't even come out in 1974. They're both going to come out in 1975. And we've talked about that. I have a video on each of these supplements. And so he's already thinking of the idea of having a third supplement. Then you get in Strategic Review, issue number 4. And I've talked about this before. In my History of Dragon Magazine playlist, I go through all the issues of Strategic Review. And there is a little note in there where Gary is talking about the idea of publishing a new supplement where it might include content from people that write in and share their ideas with TSR and say, hey, I came up with this concept. And then if they end up publishing it, he would say like that each author would get credit for what they created. And then they would get a copy of the book kind of thing. So that's not really going to happen, but that's kind of the direction they were thinking. They were constantly looking for ways to expand this game, which is why you have this constant stream of supplements come out. Now, supplement 3 here is going to be kind of the last one in the same format of these 3. So these 3 supplements, Greyhawk, Blackmore, and Eldritch Wizardry, are done in a format that mimics the contents of those original Little Brown books for D&D. So the first section of each of these books is always men and magic. So it's character classes. It covers combat, interestingly enough, and like anything about playing a character. So spells are going to be in there for character classes that have spells and things like that. And then the middle section of these books is going to be monsters, and it's going to go over, obviously the monsters and treasure part. So if there's any new treasures, they're going to add that in the middle section. And at the end of these books, it's going to go over underworld and wilderness adventures. Usually that's in the format of DM advice, which is what you get in Greyhawk. In Blackmore, that section is the Temple of the Frog adventure. And it also talks about like underwater adventures and how to do that. And this one's going to be a little bit different, but we'll get to that when we get to that section of the book. So what I'm going to do is go through this book essentially section by section and talk about those big pieces that I mentioned kind of in the intro. So Druids and Psionics and the key monsters, the alternative combat system, and the treasures. Okay, so let's start out by looking at the foreword to our book. Now, this is written by Tim Kask, who, again, is the editor for this book. He's the TSR Publications editor, but definitely oversaw this book. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically he says that it represents new dimensions to an already fascinating game, the third supplement, and it's produced to meet the ever-increasing demand for new material for Dungeons and Dragons. And he says it represents a new trend in the fine art of dungeon mastering. So he says originally D&D was only limited in scope by the imagination and devotion of dungeon masters everywhere, and the supplements have fulfilled the need for fresh ideas. But somewhere along the line, D&D lost some of its flavor and began to become predictable. That's kind of a broad statement to make, considering that there's no way that they could know how everyone's game is going, and that most people at this point, the game is new-ish. It's only been out. I mean, he writes this only about 2 years after the game's been published, and most people think it's still new and it's still fresh. But he says it's becoming predictable, and that came about as a result of the proliferation of rule sets. And this was great for us as a company. It was tough on the DM. When all the players had all the rules in front of them, it became next to impossible to beguile them into danger or mischief. So this is a long ongoing problem with Dungeons and Dragons in that, especially with like the monster manuals. So if the monster manual is out there and it's available, well, there's nothing to prevent a player from buying and reading that and knowing all the ins and outs and using their player knowledge of what these monsters are capable of, or like how to defeat a troll, for example. Because the first time you come across a troll, if you've never heard it and you see it regenerate, you're freaking out and you don't realize that, you can use fire or acid to try to do permanent damage. But if you already know that, some of that mystery is gone. So I get what he's saying, but he says they're trying to mitigate that by coming up with some new ideas here. So he says that The introduction of psionic combat is bound to enliven games grown stagnant. It opens up untold possibilities for both the players and the DM, and in so doing recognizes one of the favorite topics of science fiction and fantasy writers, the unknown powers of the mind. That has been very controversial in Dungeons and Dragons, this idea of psionics and this blending of fantasy and science fiction. And we'll get to that when we get to the psionics section. But he's stating right out the gate that that's one of the things that they were looking for, like a goal to accomplish with including psionics. Now, it is well known that Tim Kask really liked psionics. He said as much. And that even Gary Gygax was not as much of a fan. So Gary, by his own admission, did not use psionics in his fantasy role-playing game adventures, and Tim Kask thought it was cool. And so you have this kind of like, I think an interesting dynamic where the co-creator of the game isn't really super excited about this, but starting to listen to other people that they've hired, bringing people on board, and Tim really, being the editor, kind of promoting this idea of including it. And then he says, it follows the same format of the original 3 booklets. And then it says, it's, as you noted on the title page, there were many contributors. All right, so that's the foreword. And then, you've got your index here, which is really like a table of contents. And then you get into your first section, Men and Magic. And just this, once again, just goes to show how, I think that obviously the layout and the organization of this made sense to them at the time. There's a reason that they put it in this order, but reading it and trying to parse out the parts that you need for each individual piece becomes very confusing because it's all intermingled. And you'll see what I mean here in just a second. So you start out with your characters and additions, and it says there's a special category of character which crosses all 4 major player character classes. Those with psionic ability may be found amongst fighting men, magic users, clerics, or even thieves. And then further details of psionic abilities will be found in this section, determination of abilities. Then you get to the major class of clerics. There's a new subclass, the Druid. They're similar to the monster, the same name as described in Greyhawk Supplement 1. And if this subclass is allowed in the campaign, then you should update your monster accordingly. Okay, and then he talks about what a monster is. And so basically it just means anything that's controlled by the DM. So it could be a lawful or good cleric, or it could be like a Balrog. So again, now this is again why I wanted to point this out. This is the 9th printing from 1979, and yet somehow a reference to a Balrog has still come in here. That should have been changed. So TSR removed Ents, Balrogs, Hobbits. Those 3 specifically. There was others as well, I believe, due to some issues with the Tolkien estate, and they replaced them with, like treants instead of Ents and halflings instead of hobbits. However, later on in here, you're going to see a table that mentions hobbits. So also just showing, like, honestly, that's a poor editing job that somebody didn't catch that. Okay, so I know there was a lot of them, and they didn't have the ease of doing like a search and replace like we have now. But it gets confusing when you see these terms when you know that they're not supposed to be using them anymore. And then it says all player characters with psionic ability or those desiring to become druids must be of human origin. So if you want to use psionics, you have to be human. If you want to be a druid, you have to be human. Okay, so he introduces them here, and then he goes on to talk about fighting men and what kind of psionic powers that they can have. So what's interesting in the depiction of psionics in here is that you have different psionic abilities based on your character class. So you choose from a different list. However, we're not going to talk about psionics right now, so I'm going to have to come back to this because we want to talk about druids. So then here at the bottom of the page. So you're talking psionics, fighting men and psionic ability, magic users with psionic ability, and clerics with psionic ability. And then druids, completely not about psionics, are a subclass of clerics, neutral in nature, as mentioned in Greyhawk, and they're more closely attuned to nature, serving as its priest rather than some other deity. And then mistletoe takes a place of importance with them as a holy symbol or item, as crosses and other like items do with other types of clerics. So what's interesting in here, so there's a few things. First, the monster description of the druid in Greyhawk basically says that they're a combination of cleric magic user. Right here. Priests of a neutral type religion, and they differ in armor and hit dice as well as movement capability. Cleric magic users, they can shape change 3 times a day, once each to any reptile, bird, or animal, respectively, from size as small as a raven to as large as a small bear. Generally accompanied by a number of barbaric followers who are fighters, with a few higher level leaders and a body of normal men. Okay, so that's it. That's all you get about druids in here. Now here they're going to change that, and they're no longer cleric magic users. They're going to get their own spell lists. So where did this idea for druids come from? Well, first off, I have a whole video on kind of like the history of druids in Dungeons and Dragons and some other classes. So I'll put a link to that up here, and you can kind of follow the druid over time and get some of its inspirations. But what's interesting here, and it's, it's called out right here in the special thanks, Dennis Sester, and it says the Great Druid. So we've talked about Dennis Sester before. He is the creator of Bunnies and Burrows. So one of the very first role-playing games, developed in 1976, going to come out the same year as this. So the first role-playing game developed where player characters are playing animals, not some form of human or human-like creature like an elf or like whatever. So, but he creates the druid, and the story that he says that comes along is that as early as 1974, he and his group of players that were playing Dungeons and Dragons, so he discovers it very early on. They're playing, he's, I think, in college at the time, and he sees that people are playing like a, D&D using the chainmail combat rules. And so he realizes that like you have these roles of clerics, magic users, and fighters, but there's place for more. So he says even before he'd seen the Thief and Greyhawk, he started working up ideas for other types of classes you could have. And for whatever reason, Druid was one of them. And so people have asked, and I, have some suppositions in my video on the history of druids and like where the idea might have come from. But Dennis himself says it really didn't come from any kind of fictional source. It came from reading literature about England, the history of England, and particularly during Roman times. And that's where the idea of druids came from. So he developed this class, and then, an early version of photocopying, he mimeographed it and shared it with his players. And one of his players, by the name of Gary, I think I'm going to say Gerke, Gehrke. So he has a copy of this mimeograph thing, part of their play group, and they're at Gen Con, and this mimeograph copy of this druid class gets into the hands of Gary Gygax. So there's different kind of versions of the story. Sometimes it's, people approach Dennis, the TSR approaches Dennis because they've heard of the class. Sometimes Gary's seen the mimeograph, but the general gist of it is that, Gary is exposed to this class, and he kind of like puts it away for like a future day, and then comes back and works with Dennis to get the class worked up and then included in here. So the version that we see of the druid here in Eldritch Wizardry is actually from Dennis Sester, and it, with edits done by Gary and Tim Kask. But just as a fun little aside, in the 1978 Player's Handbook, when you look at the druid spell list, you'll see a spell here for 7th level called the Chariot of Sestar, so 2 R's instead of 1. But that was a direct reference to the creator of the druid class, Dennis Sester. So that's why that spell exists. So I thought that was kind of cool that they did that. And he didn't create that. So that spell, he said, was either created by Gary or Tim. I guess is an homage to kind of like, call him out for having created the class. So it goes on to talk about the class. And, they're used to fire and natural forces, and living things tend to be their forte. They can't turn undead. So why is this called a subclass? Well, in general, the use of the term subclass at this point in time and lasting through to advanced Dungeons and Dragons means that for the most part, the main class and any subclasses are going to have the same hit dice. They're going to have the same attack matrices, and they're going to have the same saving throw matrices. And usually, but not always, they're going to have the same allowances for equipment and that kind of thing. So druids are different in that obviously they don't, even right from the very beginning, they're only allowed to wear leather armor and use a certain, very limited group of weapons. However, they can use edged weapons, but they can only use like wooden shields and that kind of thing. So that is very different from a cleric who can use any armor and can only use blunt weapons. So those are a little bit different, but everything else is very consistent. So it talks about them speaking their own special language, and they can also speak common, of course, and then they can learn all these different languages as they go up in level. Nixie, Dryad, Elvish, Treant, Hill Giant, Centaur, Manticore, and Green Dragon. So it talks all about that, and then it says they have an obligation to protect woodland animals and plants, and especially trees. So this is basically describing the kind of the background of the class, but there's no mechanics here. So those are always going to come later. That's very consistent with how the material is presented in these early editions. And it does make it confusing. I think you have to read about what a druid is here, and then later on figure out the experience points tables and all that kind of stuff is going to come later. All right. So, and then it says monks and druids do not have psychic potential. So it's interesting that they call out monks here because they are going to institute a thing in the druid section here where druids of higher level have to basically face each other in spell-based combat in order to advance in level, because there's only a certain number at the higher levels. And then it's going to tell you that there's no druid above level 13, but that's going to come later. Okay, but it says they don't have psychic potential. All right, and so then you finish with druids. Now we're back to thieves, and it's talking about the psionic potential for thieves. And then it gives you your character alignment, including various monsters and creatures. So this is really interesting because, again, this is one of those sort of in-between books. So Holmes edition, we had a whole video on that, is really that. But some of the things that we're going to see in Holmes start to be kind of like telegraphed here. So you see the alignment, it's still sticking with the three of law, neutrality, and chaos. But the one that really sticks out is mind flayers. So it has 4 asterisks here, and the 4 asterisks means highly evil, but otherwise lawful. So in earlier versions, you usually associated law with kind of being good. And when you look at the alignment of creatures in original Dungeons and Dragons, like Men in Magic, the lineup of creatures like vampires and, like undead things, they're all, or like evil high priests are listed under chaos. And then things like unicorns and, like that kind of stuff are listed under law. Okay, but here for the first time, I think it might be for the first time, you see a listing of a monster under law, but then it tells you that they're evil. So that's kind of like it's presaging the 5-point alignment system that we're going to get in the Holmes edition. And also, because that article that Gary Gygax wrote where he talks about, he puts that 5-point alignment system into an article. It's either Strategic Review or Dragon. I think it was Strategic Review. So he has like evil and good and law and chaos and neutrality. And then he inserts that into Holmes. Holmes originally was the 3-point system from here, but the editors at TSR changed that. Okay, and so then now you get to determination of abilities, and it's going to tell you how to create a psionic character. So that's going to last for a while, how to create a psionic character. And now we're back to druids. So it's like the level and number of experience points necessary to attain them, and it covers your psionic characters. And then it gives you your experience point tables for druids and their level titles. And then it tells you that these clerics all serve the same general deity nature. So now we're back to like background of druids. So the above the level of initiate, the number of persons is strictly limited. This is that combat that I was talking about. So it's very much based on like the monk system of improving in experience points at higher levels. And so there says there's no level above 13th, the Great Druid. And then you get your fighting capability and your hit dice and your spells per level. Okay. And then it's going to go into the alternate combat system. Now, later on in here, so you have to keep going through the book. you're going to go all the way through the psionic attack section. And again, we're going to talk about that later. Then you're going to get your list of Druid spells, which is interesting because it says magic users and then it says druids. It should say clerics, druids. And then you get your description of the different psionic powers. And then we're finally going to get back in here to the explanation of spells, clerics, druids, and like the explanation of all the spells that they have. So, you know, it is very difficult to kind of read through that and figure out what's going on because they keep intercutting between psionics and druids rather than just putting all the druid stuff up front and then putting all the psionic stuff after that, or vice versa. It's constantly intercutting between the two. And if you're not being very careful in reading the headings, you can get very confused very easily about what they're talking about. But the druids in here, again, appear in here as a player character class, and then they're going to be part of the game for the next 5 decades or whatever. So they're going to be a cleric subclass in first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, debuting in the player's handbook here that we were just looking at. And then they're also going to be a version of, it's like a subclass, but in second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, they use a little bit of different terms. So there's this like all-encompassing term that they call priest. And then a cleric is a very specific kind of priest. That's sort of like your more militant priest that we're used to from the original game. And then druids are shown as an example of a priest that like, you know, focuses on nature, and they have like different abilities. And then later on in the complete priest handbook, they're going to blow that whole thing out and come up with like all different kinds of priests of different, religions and you know, faiths and pantheons and all that kind of stuff, and give them like different abilities and things like that. But the druid was an example of doing that in second edition. In third edition Dungeons and Dragons, druid is going to become just a core class, so they get rid of the idea of subclasses in third edition. And in 3.5, in fourth edition, druids are not in the main player's handbook as memory serves. They come in a later player's handbook. I want to say player's handbook 2, which focuses on like some of the classes, like more wild character, like barbarians, druids, that kind of thing, are going to be like in the player's handbook 2. And then in fifth edition, obviously, they come back as a core class again, so, and have been part of the game. And then they're also in the 2024 edition. So that's kind of like the history of the druid, but it all first appears all the way here. And like, again, looking at this list of spells, we didn't like go into the spells too much, because that wasn't the intent of this video here. But if you look at these spells, you're going to recognize spell names that you've seen for druids: predict weather, locate animals, detect snares and pits, pyrotechnics, call lightning, plant growth, neutralize poison. I mean, these are all things that are very, very common to this day with druids, and they all start all the way back here in Eldritch Wizardry. Okay, so that's druids. Next, we're going to talk about psionics. Okay, so psionics. This is one of the more controversial topics in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, as far as like a game mechanic. I'm not talking about, you know, aesthetics or anything like that. But where did psionics come from? So there's a lot of stuff going on here that kind of lead up to the unveiling and the debut of the psionic system as presented in Eldritch Wizardry. But you can look at sort of like the source fiction. So, and again, I think a lot of people have an issue where they'll say how, you know, psionics is more science fiction and it's not fantasy. Well, you have to remember that the inspirational fiction that the creators were reading when they designed Dungeons and Dragons or were playing these games, they're, that's like pulp stories from like the 30s, 40s, and 50s, okay, maybe in 60s, and comic books as well, right? And back then, there was much less of this like, strict line between science fiction and fantasy and horror. A lot of times they were just kind of all blended together, and people didn't necessarily make such a big deal about it. It's really, I mean, D&D really is one of the cultural, things that happens to create this sort of division. Okay. And it's not just D&D, but it helps to cement it, right? So Tolkien, I think, is another big one. So Tolkiensian fantasies kind of become like the standard of what people think of fantasy really is. Okay. Especially like in the 80s and 90s. And and because you have all these stories that are like kind of like that, you've got Sword of Shannara stories and all that, but even that has science fiction elements if you actually know about those stories. So, and the creators, I think, of Dungeons and Dragons, we know Dave Arneson had a lot of science fiction elements in his game. I've talked about that many times here before. Gary Gygax wrote the famous Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, which involves again, if you ever want to play this, I guess don't listen to this part for the next minute, but involves investigating a crashed spaceship and finding power armor and ray guns and all that kind of stuff. So even the D&D magic system, so which people call Vancian magic, which is that fire and forget style of magic. Well, that comes from these stories, The Dying Earth. This is science fiction. Okay, so there's fantasy elements in this, but this takes place on a future Earth where the sun is dying. And the way that magic works in here, they're like formulas that people have to memorize. They're so complex. And the complexity means that your brain isn't able to hold on to that formula once you've released the energy when you cast that spell. Okay, but that comes from these science fiction stories. Okay, so like the Witch World stories also. Which by Andre Norton. Gary Gygax mentions those in Appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and those involve characters using a blend of magic and mental, like mind powers. Okay, so as far as Dungeons and Dragons specifically, I really think kind of the first sense that you get of what Psionics is going to turn into comes with the debut of the Mind Flayer from Strategic Review, issue number 1. So I have talked about this before. Again, as a reminder, I do have a whole playlist that goes through every issue of Strategic Review, and then I'm going through issues of Dragons, sort of like, issue by issue, usually 2 or 3 in a video. But the Mind Flayer that debuts in Strategic Review, the write is very small, but it specifically mentions that its main form of attack is a mind blast, and it's like described as being this wave of psi force, and it's super powerful, and there's really nothing that you can kind of do to defend yourself against it, other than like a straight up saving throw. And if you fail that, the consequences, depending on your intelligence, are going to be like at the most extreme, like death, and then at the but you could be in a coma, you could sleep. There's different things that can happen, all the way up to like making you insane, causing insanity. And so that was this really powerful monster. And it is you're really kind of hinting at this idea of like these sort of alien type creatures that have these mental powers. Okay. So Gary Gygax basically says that he thought that was really kind of like almost, not that it was too powerful, but like since there was really no way to defend against it, he started toying around with the idea of creating a character class that he called the Divine, which is, I don't think, a great name, but he was toying with this, and he kind of play tested it with some of his players. But the idea was that this was a character that had like these mental attacks and defenses. Okay. And he based it on the main character from this book, Hero's Journey by Sterling Lanier, also in Appendix N of Dungeon Master's Guide. It's also listed as an influential text for the 1978 Gamma World game. Okay, but this is a post-apocalyptic Earth game after like a nuclear war where people have gained powers because of background radiation. And the main character in this book is Hero Destine. Or you could say Hiro, I guess. I've always said hero. So, but he has these mental powers that he has. So he's like a priest kind of, but his powers, he is able to like attack and defend people through his use of these mental powers. And so Gary Gygax used this partially as inspiration for creating this divine class that had the ability to attack people mentally, but also could defend against mental attacks. From things like a Mind Flayer, as an example. So it didn't really go too far, but that was sort of the inspiration, or one of the inspirations, for creating the Psionics system. Also, just as a side note, if you've never read this book, please go check it out. If you want to get a sense of like the quintessential dungeon crawl, you're going to find in this book. Green slime, you're going to find in this book, like all these ideas. And again, it's a post-apocalyptic book, but has a huge influence on the direction of Dungeons and Dragons as far as like a lot of the things that we consider to be iconic parts of the game. Okay, so that's Gary Gygax's class. Now, you also have, as noted here in the special thanks, Elder Steve Marsh. We've been talking about Steve a lot lately because he's been contributing a lot to these supplements. So he is going to be working on a class as early as 1974 also, after being exposed to Dungeons and Dragons. And he starts to create a class that he based on, he said, like kind of Indian mysticism, India, like from the continent of India, and or like Vedic yogis is what he says. And he called it a mystic. And his mystic had like these like different powers. So they didn't really have attacks, but they had like these different kinds of powers that they could use, or different abilities, psionic abilities. And, as they went up in level, they gained more and more abilities. And so he had that class. And again, these are things that Gary Gygax had seen. And so they actually even talk about these two classes. So the idea was that these classes were going to be published. The Mystic and the Divine are going to be published. And the reason that we know that is because when TSR ran Tomb of Horrors as a tournament module at, I think it was Origins in 1975, it actually, the module itself, the adventure write-up, mentions how diviners and mystics can defeat the Demolich that's in the Tomb of Horrors using their, psionic-based abilities that these two classes had. So the assumption is that there were players who were playing these classes, and they needed to know how those two classes could interact with this Demolich. Okay. However, those two classes are never going to see the light of day as far as published classes, because Tim Kask, as the editor, seems to be the one that made the decision that he wanted to, instead of making them classes, he wanted to make psionics available to everybody, human characters. And so he kind of strips out the abilities and the powers, the attacks and the defenses from the diviner. He strips out the abilities from the mystic, and then he puts them all into a pot and creates this system of psionics. A lot of people say it's very cumbersome. A lot of the reason that they say that, I think, comes from the way that it's presented. So my intent here is not to go through how psionics work, but really just to kind of give you a flavor. But we talked about here how it says, fighting men with psionic ability are basically attuned to the powers commonly known here as yoga. So again, you can see that influence, right, from the Steve Marsh class. Magic users will find that it will eliminate the necessity of learning some spells, which essentially give them such power for a limited duration. And then clerics gain the advantage of being able to employ many magical powers, but for every psionic ability gained, the cleric will lose 2 of his other advantages. First, they'll lose 1 spell, exactly the same as a magic user. And second, the cleric loses the ability to turn away undead monsters as he gains psionic power. So that's one of the things that balance these. There's no experience point penalty for adding psionic powers to a character, but what happens is, like, fighters lose they lose one of their followers for when they gain psionic powers, and then for every 4 levels gained, they lose 1 point of strength permanently. And then magic users have to give up spell slots essentially to gain psionic abilities, and clerics we just talked about, and then thieves lose dexterity if they have psionic abilities. Okay, so that's kind of like a description, right? And then we're going to get into, like, how do you gain psionic abilities? So this is where it starts to get a little bit, I think it's a little clunky, but if you were to put it all together and kind of read through it, it's really not that bad. It's just very confusing because it's so chopped up in here, and you can kind of forget what you were supposed to be doing. But it basically says, after you've rolled all 6 normal ability scores, the player has selected a character type. Player characters with unmodified scores of 15 or more in their intelligence, wisdom, or charisma may check to see if they have psionic ability. And basically, you roll percentile dice, and if you roll 91% to 100%, you have psionic potential. Okay, and that's it. You don't roll ever again. So you roll that at character creation, and if you roll a 0-1 to 89 or to 90%, you will never have psionic potential. Okay, it's not a level-based thing. And And then, so it talks about how you do that. And then you, as you advance in level, as is normal for their class and their prime requisite, psionic ability is affected by their psychic potential. So you make a second die roll in order to determine the level of your psychic potential. So then you have these different scores here. And essentially what it means is like at every level, you have a 10% chance of learning a certain ability. If you have the psychic ability that you rolled that, 91 to 100%. So it's 10% per level. So at third level, you have a 30% chance. However, that's affected by this secondary roll that you make here, which could give you a penalty or a bonus. So if you rolled a 1 to 10, you really only have a 4% chance per level because you're doing minus 6% chance per level cumulative. And if you've rolled 00, 100%, it's plus 3% per level. So instead of 10%, it's 13% per level. So do you see what I'm saying? Like it starts to really kind of get bogged down with all these different percentages, chances of like doing all this kind of stuff. If psionic ability is gained, there is a chance equal to the character's psychic potential that a second ability will be immediately gained. Okay. And then again, we get into our levels, and it says that as you progress in the normal character type as they originally selected, however, beginning at first level, they have the possibility of acquiring a psionic type ability, and those abilities are given under spells. Okay, so there's all of that you have to figure out. Okay, and then we're back to our druids, and we'll get to the alternate combat system later. Okay. So now we're back over here with our bonuses. No, sorry, that's for the alternative combat system. Okay, so psionic combat. Now, the other thing that you have for psionic combat is these attack modes and defense modes. So these are completely separate from the powers that you're going to be rolling your abilities. These are your psychic attacks and defense modes. So once you get a psionic ability, you immediately gain the psychic blast attack mode, but you won't get defense modes until you've gained like 3 or 4 powers, depending on what your character class is. And then these powers, it never tells you how you gain them. Do you pick them, or do you only gain them in order as you gain more? Not these powers, these attack modes and defense modes. So they're listed A, B, C, D, E. So you could assume that you are going to get them like in order, which seems likely because roughly they get more powerful as you go along. And same with the defense modes. But it never really tells you that. Okay, so you kind of have to intuit that and figure that out. And then when you're getting your powers, you're actually rolling for them. So you have to roll, and every class, like I told you, has different powers that they might be picking from. Okay, so fighters have different abilities. So here's the ones for fighters, and then magic users, and then clerics. Okay, so thieves use the fighter table. Okay, and you have to roll. And if you roll something that you already have, you have to roll again. Yeah, so it's just, and the abilities like levitation and domination and mind over body, they're very spell-like in nature. But some of the verbiage that they use to describe these body equilibrium, these are not terms that people would normally associate with sort of like a faux medieval fantasy game, which is, I think, a lot of reason why people don't necessarily like them. They could have tried to come up with some names that sounded a little bit more fanciful and a little less clinical. So even looking at the attack and the defense modes, if you look at the list, like you have ego whip and id insinuation. Like those are very, like I said, clinical kind of terms. So, yeah, so this is going to have a long legacy in Dungeons and Dragons. However, like I said, it's one that's pretty controversial. So you are going to see psionics show up in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but they are in the appendix. So you see psionics is here. System, it's very influenced by what was in Eldritch Wizardry. Okay, but it's in the appendix, which you would, means automatically that it's kind of optional, but it even comes before bards. So appendix 1 is psionics. But they're going to appear in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons until 2nd edition. They're not going to be part of the core rulebook. However, there is going to be a supplement that comes out, the Complete Psionic's Handbook. And then you're going to have in 3rd edition, there's a Psionics Handbook, and in 3.5, and they really start to kind of like define it more as a class. So second edition has a class called the Psionicist that's going to be changed to be called the Scion in third edition. And then there's a bunch of other kind of associated classes, but they're getting away from this idea that like anybody can use psionics and make it more class based. Third edition and 3.5 really kind of come up with this idea of like this juxtaposition between magic and psionics and how do they work together and how they're affected by each other. Fourth edition, there's going to be the Player's Handbook 3, which is where psionics are going to debut, and it's going to be a source of power. So fourth edition was really about all your, like, where do your powers come from? Are they martial? Are they arcane? Are they divine? Are they wild? Whatever. There is a psionic power base. And so that's where like the monk class is going to debut on the Player's Handbook 3 as a psionic power based character. And then in fifth edition, I really don't think you see psionics too much. Mostly it's been limited to, I think, the Unearthed Arcana stuff that comes out online where they're kind of like testing stuff to see what people like. I think maybe there's some stuff in Tasha's Cauldron and everything. I don't have that book because I don't play fifth edition, but my understanding is that psionics is much more limited in fifth than it has been in some of the previous editions. So that's a look at psionics and the history of how they came about, why they were created, and like I said, like some of the inspirations that went into the creating of psionics for the game. So I would love to hear from you guys if you use psionics in your games back in the day, or even if you use them now, what you think about them, and if you're one of those, sort of fantasy purists who think that they don't belong in the game, or if you're someone who really likes using psionics. And what kind of setting do you use psionics in? Is it straight up fantasy, or are you doing some kind of blend of fantasy and science fiction? So I'd love to hear about that. Leave it in the comments below and let me know. And I'd also like to ask if that you are enjoying this video and are looking for a way to support my channel. The two best ways you can do that right now are by buying something from my shop, like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, or notebook with exclusive designs that are only available in my store, tabletop role-playing game designs, but I also have some other kind of just fun, kind of, I guess, geek designs. And I have a new one that I just put up of the 6 ability scores. So you'll see that at my shop. And the other way that you can support me is by becoming a super fan, like this list of very nice folks who've been contributing to my channel, by hitting the little super fan notification under the video description when you're watching. And if you're able to contribute, that really goes a long way to helping. So, I'm constantly trying to upgrade my equipment here. I've had a lot of kerfuffles lately with, personal issues with my dad passing away and all the fires that we had and needing to have our house evacuated for a bit. And now trying to clean up all the mess in our yard with all the ash and fallen tree branches and stuff. But I will, at a certain point, try to get back into fixing my equipment, and being a super fan is a great way to help support that. I'll also point out that I am working on a Patreon right now with a designer friend of mine, and I'll be talking about that soon. But pretty soon I'll have like a monthly Patreon that you could contribute to, where you'll actually get content like exclusively for the Patreon. All right, so let's go in and finish up the last part of Men and Magic in here, which is the discussion of the alternate combat system. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it is an addition to the alternate combat system. And it says the question of when various actions take place during a melee round often arises. In order to simplify and easily satisfy the problem of when any action can take place, the melee round has been further subdivided into pre-movement, movement of 6 segments, and post-movement, or 8 parts in all. All melee activities, including missile fire, spellcasting, movement, and combat, are then assigned to some, or probably all, part of the melee turn. So this is confusing because he's talking about rounds, but then he uses the word turn here. Now, we all know what that means, but turn has a very different definition in Dungeons & Dragons than round. And he means turn as far as like each side taking turns. But, it can't, again, if you don't know that, this is like looking on it with hindsight. If you're reading this for the first time and you're trying to understand these definitions between what's a turn and what's a round and how long they are, it can be a little bit confusing. But essentially what this is going to do, again, is it's going to break the combat round into 8 segments. Why they chose 8 instead of some other more easily divisible number, I don't know. That's going to be changed in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But this system here, for the alternate combat system, is, of these segments, that is going to become part of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So in this book specifically, this supplement you really start to see the seeds of what is going to happen in advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So even though this is written for the original version of the game, original Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of the concepts that come in here are going to become part of advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and they're not going to make their way into like the basic Dungeons and Dragons line. Again, what I called back in the day basic, but the Holmes, which is kind of the outlier because it kind of straddles between all the editions, but like specifically like the Moldvay and then the Menser versions of Dungeons and Dragons, they're not going to have segments, okay? But this one's going to have segments. And it talks about also something that you're going to see in here is going to be using dexterity to determine who goes first or like when actions take place. So you're going to see that pop up on Holmes. They're definitely going to use that dexterity based kind of initiative sort of thing. But it debuts actually first in here. And you're computing your adjusted dexterity based on magical devices and then getting a complete bonus or penalty. Okay, and so then it starts to get confusing because you have to use this table down here. So you have missile fire or spell casting table in the first melee round. You have to have your adjusted dexterity, and then you see all your different segments here: pre-movement, your 6 combat segments, and then your post combat. And using this table, it gets a little wonky, I think. So I don't really think it's explained all that well, but it's this idea of, again, adding further granularity, needing to understand at the exact point in that round when a thing is going to happen, when you're casting a spell. And again, that's going to impact advanced Dungeons and Dragons of like, when does a spell actually, when you cast a spell, when does the effect of that spell actually take place? And so you're going to have in advanced Dungeons and Dragons telling you how many segments it takes to cast that spell and at what point does the spell effect happen. So then you have all these things, adjustments to dexterity for a bonus, and elves get a bonus if your weapon is in hand, if your weapon's ready, if your spell or scroll is ready, that kind of thing. But then penalties for wearing different kinds of armor, okay, or having wounds over 50% and wounds over 75%. So that's a lot of people think that the D&D combat system is not realistic because as you lose hit points, it doesn't affect your combat ability. You have the same combat ability at 1 hit point as you do at full hit points. Makes no change. That doesn't bother me because I understand that the combat is supposed to be abstract, but a lot of people don't like that. Well, this is a way that you can implement that by basically you're going to slow down and you're going to take a penalty on when you act, which segment you act on in the round based on how many wounds you have. So I think it adds unnecessary complexity that slows combat down when you want it to actually be sped up and be more dynamic, and you're referring to tables and subtracting things and not counting out segments and that kind of stuff. But a lot of people dig this kind of stuff, which is why it's in here, right? So they were looking at what people were really wanting to do, and that's why they added that combat system here, okay? Then you have your definition of, like I said, the psionic combat, all that. So the men and magic section in here takes up the majority of this book. So it goes all the way from page 1 to page 26. And this is only, I believe it's a 60-page supplement. Yeah, it's 60 pages. So almost half is made up of the men and magic section. And that's because the psionic combat takes such a large, or psionics in general take up such a large part of this. But you've got that alternative combat system, and then you have to describe a whole new class with druids. Okay, so monsters and treasures. So you're going to get these monsters here, and you see demons listed here. So that's the big thing that comes out of this. I mean, all these creatures are new here. Okay, so, and a lot of them are designed specifically to act as foils for characters who have psionic ability. So when you have psionic ability, you do have a little bit of a leg up on other character types that don't have it. And so one of the things that they created were these monsters, thought eaters and brain moles and cerebral parasites. Obviously, mind flayers were part of it, intellect devourers, but creatures that attack people that have psionic ability. So that's a constant thing that you're worrying about. If you use your psionic abilities, you can potentially draw these types of creatures to you and have them attack you, and you are more vulnerable to them because you have psionic ability. But demons really, I think, would be the big part coming out of this book. And so these are mostly going to be designed by Gary Gygax. All right, here is a piece of artwork. This is by Tracy Lesh. This is a Lich. This is the one piece of artwork by Tracy. And here, Tracy did artwork a lot in the the early books, the earlier supplements, but also the original books for D&D. But this is the only one that's going to be in here. But it's a good one. It's a lich, and it's very much sticking with the Eldritch Wizardry theme of there's probably some kind of crazy ritual going on here. Okay, but it goes on. This section talks about all the monsters that might have psionic ability and what they could be. Now, I think some of this is really fun. Like it talks about psionic ability for gray oozes and yellow molds. I think that's cool. I think having something that people would assume would just be like a mindless, like having no sensory things other than just feeding and trying to create more, propagate, but giving them the ability where it says like exceptional individuals have latent psionic ability. This is for the gray ooze. And if psionic powers are used within 6 inches of them, they will prepare a psychic crush of from 21 to 121 psionic strength attack points and directed at any individual within range who uses psionic abilities. So I think that's really cool. And then again, you've got that thing going on with the yellow mold here and their psionic abilities. So, something cool to try. I think my memory is that that's not something that carried over into later editions, was giving psionic abilities to oozes and jellies and molds and things like that. So, but I could just be remembering incorrectly. So now you have your demons, and there's this whole discussion on here of like what demons are and where they live, and that what they're all about. So it says each type of demon, as well as the demon princes such as Orcus and Demogorgon, have many extraordinary characteristics. So this is where demons come from. So Orcus and Demogorgon, obviously huge parts of the game up until this day. Demogorgon also, mentioned in Stranger Things, not the way we think of it, but it is mentioned in there. So these are all the different kind of demons. Now, what's fun for these, so this is a type 1, you've got your type 2 and type 3. If you look at this book, Art and Arcana, Visual History of Dungeons & Dragons, probably for my money the best book published by Wizards of the Coast, at least best book published by Wizards of the Coast about Dungeons & Dragons. There's a section in here where they show this early, so we can flip that over because the page keeps coming up. It shows this early kind of chart or, note that Gary Gygax made. So this is Gary Gygax's writing here for demons, where he's explaining what he wants each of them to look like. So you see them labeled type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which he labels type 5 as the Balrog. That's actually going to be type 6. And then he's got Orcus and Demogorgon. But then he describes like what their build is, their skin, what their head is like, their face, their horns, their body, their arms, their legs, wings, tail, all that stuff is in these notes that he gave to the artist, which is going to be Dave Sutherland. And that's what Dave used to draw these monsters. So this is the kind of stuff that you get in this book that I think is really fun. So Gary had envisioned what these things look like and then gave this instruction to the artist, and then the artist just tried to replicate it because, of course, they don't have any visual reference for these things. They have no idea what they're supposed to look like. So again, highly recommend picking up a copy of that book if you've never seen it before. So this is the type 1, which is later going to be called a Vrock in later editions. You've got type 2, the Hezrau. Again, kind of this frog-looking thing. Vrock is, of course, vulture. You've got your type 3 here, and it just goes on to talk about all these. Now, types 1, 2, 3, and 4 are, for the most part, what I understand is that those are creations from whole cloth by Gary Gygax. Like, he kind of came up with those and labeled them types 1 through 4. Later editions, again, they're going to get like names associated with them, like I said, like Vrock and Hezrau and Glabberzau, whatever that one is. Then you have your succubus with, again, some titillating art there. And then you've got your type 5, which is later going to be called a Merilith. And a lot of people think that was based on kind of like looking at a combination of Buddhist and Hindu and maybe some Mesopotamian kind of art and creatures and kind of combining them into that. And then you've got the type 6. So there's your type 5. You can kind of see those influences I was just talking about. Now your type 6 is the Balrog, which of course at this point they're not supposed to be calling it that. So in here you'll see no mention that it's called a Balrog. In later editions, they're going to call that a Balor, Balor, which is actually an Irish term for a giant, but that's not what this is. This is a straight up Balrog with the name filed off and replaced with the name Type 6 Demon. Okay, and then you're going to have Orcus. So Orcus is a real name from mythology. So Prince of the Underworld, and from, I want to say it was Roman mythology. Let me check my notes here. But yeah, he's just kind of like a god of the underworld, gets associated with like Pluto and Hades and just Disperter, all these kinds of different things. And that's Orcus. Now, you also have the debut of Demogorgon here. Okay, now Demogorgon is an interesting case. Most people think that the name for Demogorgon, which is historical, by the way, comes from a misreading of a Greek word, demiurge, which was sort of like an artisan-like figure responsible for fashioning and maintaining the physical universe. And somehow that got misinterpreted over time and turned into something that we now think of as being like this kind of predecessor god, evil creature type thing that, Gary Gygax here is calling a demon prince. But so this goes all the way back to like Greek writing, and then first kind of mentioned by name as Demogorgon in I think it was like a late Roman era Latin epic poetry. But also shows up in works by like Moby Dick mentions Demogorgon, and Bryce Shelley's Prometheus Unbound mentions Demogorgon. So these are things that Gary was drawing inspiration from history and folklore, and it just shows how well read he is, because it's not like these are common names back then. So Gary was a voracious reader and loved history and this kind of stuff. So it makes sense that he would know about these kinds of things. And then, of course, he's putting his own spin on it because there's not a lot of like illustrations and things like that. So he's deciding what he wants them to look like and what kind of powers and abilities they have. But Orcus and Demogorgon and all of these demon types are going to be part of the game throughout. So, of course, you have demons sort of removed in second edition for a little bit until they come back as I think the Tanari or something, or or maybe the Tanari or the Devils. I forget. They had to remove demons and devils from second edition, but again, they come back by a different name, and that's where you start having all these like other names. Instead of calling it a type 1 demon, you call it a Vrog and things like that. So, but they're still part of the game to this day. And again, I think Orcus and Demogorgon are probably two of the best known of the demons in the game of Dungeons and Dragons, at least like named types of demons. Okay. So then it talks, and again, you're going back in here talking about the psionic ability of all these other creatures that have appeared in previous monster sections, either of the supplements or of the original game. Okay. And then you're going to get to the treasures. Now, this is, I find this fascinating because look at the design and layout of this versus everything that you've seen before, other than like these little things like monsters and treasure here, where you're using that kind of faux, like I said, Old English font for that. But here you have like these big size headers for every different artifact that's going to be in here. And I always wonder, like, why didn't they do that back here? Why didn't you have a section for druids with that big typeface, and so that you could find what you were looking for, one for psionics or one for druid spells, like all that kind of stuff? You don't have that. It's just buried in here at the back out of nowhere. But anyway, this is going to be the debut of a lot of these iconic treasures that are part of the game all the way to today, like the Axe of the Dwarvish Lords. I always thought it was interesting that he said Dwarvish instead of Dwarven. Everywhere else, a reference in Dungeons and Dragons, it says Dwarven and Elven, but here it says Dwarvish. So, but still part of the game today. The infamous Sword of Koss, the Mace of Cuthbert. You've got the Wand of the Seven Parts. You have the Wand of Orcus. So again, I'm not going to read all of these, but like just showing you how many of these debuted in here. The Codex of the Infinite Planes, the Hand of Vecna, the Eye of Vecna. Now, Vecna is an anagram of the name Vance. So Jack Vance, the writer that we talked about from the Dying Earth stories, that's where that name came from. Now, those two, I believe, are attributed to Brian Bloom. It seems like he was the guy who created those two. But if that is the case where that's all that he put in here, it seems odd that he would get his name on the cover, considering how much work was done by, Tim Kask with the Psionics and with, Steve Marsh also with Psionics creating that stuff, or Dennis Sester creating the Druid class. Their names are not on the cover. But, we talked about that before. Baba Yaga's head is obviously from Russian folklore, Slavic folklore, but a lot of these things are just made up from whole cloth. So I can't really find a lot of, I did a lot of research to try to figure out like where did the ideas for some of these come from. It seems like they just came from either Gary's imagination, a combination of that, and other people maybe contributing ideas, and also things that happened in game, like in a game, and then they added these to them. So I know a lot of people have wondered, like, were these all part of Gary's Greyhawk campaign? And it seems like originally they all weren't, but a lot of them were added later. Obviously, the Vecna stuff and Kos and all that kind of become part of Greyhawk. But my understanding is that they weren't originally part of it. However, if you know different, definitely leave that in the comments below and let me know. The Iron Flask of Turney the Merciless, Queen Alyssa's Marvelous Nightingale, The Mighty Servant of Luco, The Machine of Lum the Mad, always one of my favorites. The Jacinth of Inestimable Beauty. I actually don't know how to pronounce that word. Jacinth? The Crystal of the Ebon Flame. So those are, you've got Heward's Mystical Organ, The Horn of Change, The Ring of Gax, obviously a play on Gary's last name. The Crowns, Orbs, and Scepters. The Throne of the Gods. So a lot of these are things that you're going to see appear in all the later editions of Dungeons and Dragons, the Orbs of Dragonkind. And then you have this whole section here on artifacts and relics and like what kind of powers and abilities they might have when you're generating your own. Okay, so that's all kind of cool. So you can create your own things like that. Now we get to the section on Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. There's no advice in here. There's nothing. All this is revising the encounter tables to include all of the new kinds of creatures that you've seen over the past few supplements, including the ones that debut in this book. So you have astral and ethereal encounters. So you've got underworld, outdoor, and space. So you see, again, science fiction. Then you have psionic encounters, underworld or outdoors. And then you have wilderness wandering monsters, and this is a correction. And so then you've got clear woods, river, swamp, mountains, desert, city, and ruins, and what kind of creatures you might encounter in each of those areas. And it just keeps going on. Flyers, undead types, giant types, true giants, lycanthropes, dragon class swimmers, demon class, miscellaneous monsters, enchanted type monsters, animals. And then you have jungle-like, optional woods, swamp and marsh, and optional mountains. So that's going to wrap up this particular book. I know I went through that last section really quickly, but I just kind of wanted to show, like, again, where these ideas come from. And a lot of the write-ups that we're going to see for these artifacts, so you're going to see them next appear in the 1979 Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. It's a huge part of that book. It's for a lot of people, it's their favorite part of that book, reading through all those artifacts. So I'll go through that a little bit more in detail when I cover my in my series where I'm talking about like the differences in each edition. So far I've covered how Holmes Basic was different from original D&D. And then I've covered how the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual was different from Holmes and from original. And then I'm going to be doing the Player's Handbook at a certain point. It's a lot of detail. Like the Holmes video was one video, and Advanced D&D is going to be, I think, probably 3 videos talking about the differences in the rules, because the rules are a lot more complex. They're more detailed. So that's going to be a look at Eldritch Wizardry Supplement 3 from 1976. So I would love to hear your thoughts about this book. What did you think of this book? Did you use it when it came out? Again, did you use Psionics? Do you like Druids? Do you not like Druids? I personally like Druids. I never used Psionics. I always had it on my sheet if I had a character that could have qualified. I would make the roll and I would write everything down, but I never used it in game. I did play a druid for a while, so that was kind of fun. And I've played in games where we've encountered artifacts that are very similar or inspired by the ones in here, but not directly. They were twisted for whoever's campaign world it was, kind of like tweaked to make a little bit more sense in the world. And we never use, to be honest, I never used the AD&D combat system. So we were too lazy to read and understand that it was different. So we always used the Moldvay basic combat system that does not have segments, because we just assumed the advanced system was the same. And it wasn't until years later that I figured out, like, oh, it's actually quite different. Because like we didn't know what segments were, so we just ignored it. Like, you know, we just wanted to play. We didn't want to sit down and read a you know, what seemed like a school book to learn how to do combat. So we just used the system that we've been using all along. So this was a little bit of a mixed, this would have been a mixed bag had I seen it when it first came out. I know I would have wanted to get it and would have been excited because I like character classes. So I like the Druid part. It's probably my favorite part of this book, and the demons are pretty cool. You know, I think that adds a really cool layer to the Dungeons and Dragons cosmology by adding those in, especially Orcus and Demogorgon. But again, I would love to hear your thoughts, so leave that in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places where you can join me on social media like Facebook and Instagram and Blue Sky. I'm trying to be a little bit more active on Blue Sky recently. And then also you'll find links to my blog where you know, I share content from time to time, and I'm gonna hopefully be doing that more soon, as soon as I get past all this stuff with my dad and all that paperwork and stuff that I have to deal with. And that is going to wrap up this particular video. I hope you enjoyed it. So again, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, happy gaming, stay safe, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I thought this would be fun and a little different. So today I am just drinking a simple highball. However, I guess you can't really call it a highball. There's no spirit in this. So this is a non-alcoholic beverage that I made using some of this. This is a mango shrub that I made. It's been in my fridge, and it's on its last legs here. I'm almost done with it. But a shrub is a very old style of mixer that people used to drink. And it is a base of some kind of flavoring. It doesn't always have to have fruit, although many of them do. I used mango in mine. And with the addition of sugar, water, and vinegar. So I used apple cider vinegar in mine. But you can kind of use whatever vinegar you want. So you get kind of this almost tart, and it is a little bit fruity from the mango, and then it's sweet obviously from the sugar. And but it's really good for like digestion. The vinegar part helps your stomach, like after a meal. But I also just find the flavor very pleasant. Now, you can use these in cocktails. There are lots of different cocktail recipes that call for shrubs, but I'm simply doing some shrub, and then I put some sparkling water in here. I'm using San Pellegrino again, like I did last week, because that's again what I had in the house. And then some ice, and I just gave it a quick little zhuzh with my straw, and it's extremely refreshing. It's very cold here, at least it's cold for Southern California standards. It's been in like the 60s, or maybe low 70s today, so that's not really cold, but it's not like I need a refreshing drink, but it was just kind of a nice change of pace from having like another alcoholic beverage. So I will put my recipe for making my mango shrub. I'll put that in the show notes if you're interested in trying it. It's really not that difficult. The hardest part is making sure that your mangoes are at the right amount of ripeness, and then getting all the fruit extracted out when you're making the shrub, because you want that mango flavor. And sometimes if your mangoes aren't quite ripe, it's you're just not going to get enough flavor. The first time I did it, I had that problem. I kind of rushed the process. I should have let my mangoes sit a little bit longer. All right, but cheers, and thanks for watching. And now, next up, this is Thelonious Monk. Very, very famous, very influential bop style piano player. And this album I thought was hilarious because check the name out. This is Les Liaisons Dangereuses. So I was mentioning the diplomacy zine that's known as Liaisons Dangereuses. And so I thought, hey, I knew I was going to be mentioning that. And I thought I would spin this album. That's a lot of fun. Now it says 1960. So this is actually a soundtrack to the movie Les Liaisons Dangereuses. And the movie is based on a novel that was written in the 18th century. Thelonious Monk and his group provided the soundtrack for this movie, and it was recorded in 1959. The movie came out in 1960. However, the tracks for this album were not found until 2017, I think it was. It's a double album. So what happened was this session was laid down. You see here, July 27th, 1959, in New York, and recorded. And then it, for whatever reason, I mean, the movie came out, but the soundtrack and all of like the alternate cuts that you see down here, all this kind of stuff, was just put away and lost, forgotten, never released. And what happened was there were some music people and producers and things like that that were actually looking for some unreleased tracks by Barney Weiland, tenor saxophone player. And while going through his collection, they ended up finding this, and they were shocked that this was in here in like perfect condition. It was recorded like archival quality. It sounds great. Now, what happened with this is that Monk put his normal playing group at this time was Charlie Rouse on tenor, Sam Jones on double bass, and Art Taylor on drums. So Barney Weiland is just an addition to this, and it's one of the very few times that Monk recorded with two tenor saxophone players. But he didn't score this from scratch. Basically, what he did was take standard songs that his group had been playing, and they just kind of like reworked them a little bit to fit into the soundtrack for this movie. So you have things like Rhythming, The Crepuscule with Nellie. So Nellie is Monk's wife, and she was in the studio while they were recording this, so that makes sense. Pannonica is named after Baroness Pannonica Kroner's something. I forget her last name, but she was basically like Monk's kind of like patron. She was like the person who really liked his music and put money up so that he would continue exploring new musical styles and recording and things like that. So she was also in the studio. So this is named for her. But the most famous song, I think, if you're a slight jazz aficionado, if you don't know the song, but you might know the song, is this one, Well You Needn't. That's probably, it's become a jazz standard. It's very catchy. I really like that song. I've heard people put lyrics to it. Originally, it didn't have lyrics, but it's a really fun song. So you get that on here, and then you get another version down here as an alternate take, and probably I think the shining star of this, although I like that song better, is this 14-minute track of Light Blue. It's like called The Making Of. So it's including all these starts and stops, and there's like dialogue as they're talking about working out how they're going to play this song for the soundtrack. And it's all captured here on the vinyl. So it's this very nice box set, you see, and it's got this great book here with liner notes and like pictures from the movie, and which is always great. I love stuff like this when they do all these extra little additions, and it's a double LP, so you have the two different sleeves in here for both albums, and that's it. So I like Monk a lot. He's very technically proficient. He had a very interesting style of playing. I think I might have talked about it before, but usually when you play piano, when I learned to play piano, my teacher told me to like make a house with my fingers. Like, you know, you want to kind of curve and have your fingers like this. Monk was always like this, like his fingers were splayed out, and he has this, like he's banging on the keys, and it's a very unconventional way of playing. And you can hear it in the music. You can hear that his approach and probably the way that he's holding his hands is different from pretty much anyone else that you would know. So I definitely recommend giving this a chance if you can find it. I don't know if it's streaming. I should have looked that up, but I'm sure you can find it on YouTube or whatever. But give it a listen and let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. Again, cheers, and I'll talk to you next time.